there are a bunch of reasons that I wrote this book. And the main one is that cities are where at least half the world's population lives. If you include metropolitan areas, the suburbs and all that, it's more like 80% of the world's population lives in cities, and it's just getting bigger all the time as these megalopolises expand. So, you know, we can all move to the country and have our little acre, 5 acre, or whatever, and that's great as individuals, but it's the cities that really need to be transformed. They're the leverage point that we really need to be working. So this actually, my journey looking at urban permaculture really started a long time ago. I lived in Seattle for quite some time. My formal background's actually in genetics, and I was doing cancer research, immunology research. I got hired by a little research company, had tons of fun at it. It was down on the waterfront in Seattle, right next to Pike Place Market. Brilliant scientific staff. We had a blast working for the place. And then one day we discovered something useful that actually could sell, and the business turned into a drug company really fast. Went from 70 employees to 1,200 to 2,500 in the course of a few years. And I kind of woke up one day and said, I'm a mid-level manager at a drug company. How did that ever happen? And at that time, my wife was working in Microsoft. She had started out kind of similar, got bent off of her career path. She started out as a science writer, got hired by Microsoft to edit their employee newsletter, 28 pages to 30,000 employees once a week, a huge job. We were hardly ever seeing each other. We were miserable, and we just looked at each other one day and said, let's stop. Let's like just change our lives. So, yeah. And actually, I had just playing hooky from work one day, because we had just moved to a little place in the country, playing hooky from work, looking at books on homesteading. I had just discovered Bill Mollison's book, had never heard of permaculture before, but there in the homesteading section in the Seattle Library was a big black book, and I took it down and I leafed through it, and it said, wow, design, patterns, ecology, plants, climate, energy, community, shelter, livelihood. These are all the things I've ever been interested in my whole life, and I never understood how they all fit together. I just thought I had this weird collection of totally unrelated interests, and permaculture put it all together for me. So we quit our jobs. We moved down to Southern Oregon, to the Umpqua Valley. Is that a little washed out from the lights on it, or it's going to change colors? Okay, well, if it starts bothering people, like, say something. I think we'll be okay. So the Umpqua Valley outside of Roseburg, Oregon, beautiful, beautiful place. We got 10 acres there that had been clear cut in the 1970s. That's why we could afford it. The soil had washed away. It didn't have very good water, but I thought, I'm learning permaculture. I can build soil. I can, make water or something. That's a whole other story. I just put an article on my website about what to look for in land, kind of based on that experience. And we had a wonderful time there. It was awesome. We did the whole thing. We grew tons of food. We just had, I really, really cut my teeth on permaculture. I wrote Gaia's Garden. We had a tremendous time. But something that I noticed right from the start was suddenly I was driving everywhere. We were putting way more miles on our cars than I had living in the city. I mean, I was taking a bus to work in the city. Here, I was working at home, but still, the nearest store was a 20-minute drive away. If we wanted organic food, it was an hour's drive away in Eugene. Friends, because Douglas County is a huge county, I had a good friend who lived an hour and a half away. So just to socialize we were just burning through gasoline like mad. And then I noticed we lived on a 2-mile gravel road that we shared with other neighbors. Sections of it would wash out each winter in the rains, and we would get 100 to 150 cubic yards of gravel, 10 to 15 dump trucks every single winter. When my neighbors got cable TV, it took a 1/4 mile of wire from the pole to reach their house. When we hooked up to a neighbor's well, because we didn't have very good water, it was a 1/2 mile of pipe and water. And I just kept noticing, okay, I moved to the country to shrink my resource use and to have a smaller footprint, and I was using way more resources living in the country. Now, it's possible to use few resources living in the country, but you really got to be pretty hardcore off the grid, that sort of thing. 95% of all rural people in the U.S. have jobs. They don't live on the land. Only 5% actually live off of their land. So these are people who commute to jobs. They just commute longer distances. And what it really made me realize was that country life as it's presently constituted, it doesn't have to be this way, but the American way of country life is basically suburbia with really big lawns. You know, the typical pattern would be someone would move from the city, clear cut the area around their house, plant grass, put up street lights, buy an RV, you know, all this stuff. And I just realized, okay, this is driving me nuts to be consuming this many resources and to watch this. And so after a decade or so, you know, we really had accomplished what we had set out to do. So we decided it's time to move to where people were. And we were really intrigued with the city of Portland. So we moved up to Portland. And immediately, my car sat in the driveway for a week at a time. The driveway was only 20 feet long and never needed gravel. We were connected to utilities by 20 feet instead of half a mile of wire and pipe. I could walk and bike everywhere. It was a 6-minute ride to downtown, and my ecological footprint just dropped. And at the same time, I saw an article in the New Yorker by a guy who had a similar but even more extreme experience. The article was called Green Manhattan, and was by a guy who had lived in Manhattan all his life, had gotten married, lived in an apartment. When they were going to have a kid, they decided they'd move to Connecticut to, you know, have a better environment for the kid. And he had the same thing happen. They hadn't even owned a car in Manhattan. Suddenly they needed 2 cars, were driving 30,000 miles a year. His electric usage quintupled, and on and on. So he was talking about Manhattan is actually probably one of the greenest cities, certainly in the US, and maybe one in the world because of the high ridership of rapid transit, the shared walls of all the apartment buildings, that the carbon footprint of most Manhattanites is far below the US average. So this made me think about cities in a very different way, because cities get a bad rap and city people get a bad rap. And it's actually possible to have a relatively small footprint. And I mean relatively in like air quotes, because, you know, that's the American way of life still. But it intrigued me. So that's what got this book going, was just seeing the potential in cities. And what this talk is really about, I mean, permaculture, a lot of us come to it from gardening, but I think many of us have learned after we've been practicing permaculture for a couple of years or so, that its toolkit for working with land applies equally well to people, to energy, to water, to social justice issues, to community issues, to livelihood, all of these things. And that's really what the book is. Gaia's Garden is more of a how-to book, and this has got plenty of how-to in it, but it's really more of a book on how to think about these things. It's more for developing strategies to how to think about social justice and energy and community and livelihood and all of these things, how to think about being in environments with other people. Because I mean, growing food is really easy. Working together with other people is really the hard part of it. So that's the piece we need to work on. So it's no surprise, I think, that most product innovation comes from cities. Interesting things happen in cities, though more interesting than just, you know, more consumer goods, that sort of thing. There's a researcher down at the Santa Fe Institute who looked at innovation and the rates of innovation based on things like, he looked at innovation in terms of number of patents filed, new businesses started, music released, books produced, these sorts of things, just anything that might come under the heading of innovation. And he found that there's an exponential effect when we get together with others. It's not just a linear effect of, you know, 10 times more people makes 10 times more innovations. It's actually that if you live in one city that's 10 times larger than another, there's 17 times more innovations coming out of that city. And if a city is 50 times larger than another, there are 150 times more innovations coming out of that city. And I think we've all felt this. You know, when I'm around really interesting, visionary, smart people, I feel like I'm getting better ideas myself. I mean, it's kind of like after that second drink when you think you're really brilliant. But, you know, I think this is actually a real effect, you know, and there's the data on it that, you know, we get jazzed by other people, and in the right environment, that can be really, really terrific. So as a permaculturist, I want to assess first what cities are from a permaculture point of view. You know, just rather than just look at static definitions of cities, more dynamic and functional definitions from a permacultural approach. So, you know, what is a city? Well, the census definition is that it's a place with more than 25,000 people, but I don't like, you know, again, that's a static just definition. It doesn't really describe what cities do. So, yeah, right, I guess thank you. I'll just sort of push myself back here. Okay, there we go. As long as I feel that against me, I'm safe. But I think of cities as where the technological and social processes really outweigh the ecological ones, or another way to put that that's a little less of a mouthful is just where there's more pavement and people than plants. And even like my hometown of Sebastopol, the patterns that go on there are much more like San Francisco or New York than they are the forest nearby. You know, a very different set of patterns. So this definition really encompasses any place where there are significant quantities of people together. So small towns, suburbs, cities of any size is what I think of when I mean urban permaculture. Just anything that's people-related permaculture, really. So if we look at what cities are and what they do, again, just to round out our definition of cities, all cities have at least three major features in common, whether it is Babylon that Herodotus was writing about in the 5th century BC, or Tenochtitlan, where Mexico City is today, or Tikal, or New York City today. There are always certain features that every city, no matter who you are and where you are, you will see. You know, aliens coming down would identify these same qualities in cities. One of them, no surprise, is commerce. We come together to trade goods, but also to trade ideas, to trade customs, sometimes even to intermarry and things like that, get outside our genetic group. So that's one. The second one is security. Here is ancient Constantinople, or today's Istanbul, and you can see it's surrounded on 2 to 3 sides by water, and the third side's got mountains with a great big wall all the way around it. Tenochtitlan was connected to the mainland by several causeways that were easily sealed off, because there was very little law out in the wild areas, which is a fine thing, but it made people feel insecure. And so they would come into the cities. Cities also themselves, at least back then, tended to be more lawful. They were centers of administration, there were police, there were things like that. So we gathered in cities for security, and we gather in cities to be inspired. There's always monumental public spaces, gathering places, tall buildings to look at, or temples, or other forms of monuments to, to a deity, or to us, or to money, which is what most of the monuments today are built to. But that's the third common feature. So if we look at these and kind of what their ramifications are, then we've got security from both within and without, got exchange of goods and ideas in each other, we've got community gathering places, we've got inspirational and monumental space. Cities also tend to be the administrative centers for both the city itself and the area around them. The city-state certainly was the kind of apogee of that. Most cities are pretty chaotic places. This is ancient Yana, older cities certainly in Syria. The roads go all over. Some roads go over the buildings. Pathways go through people's courtyards. They're very hard to navigate in. And in Europe, at least, as the Enlightenment proceeded in the 16th and 17th centuries, this really bothered those rationalists, those Enlightenment thinkers who really wanted a solid, logical edifice for everything. And they started thinking about the planned city. How can we plan cities and design them from the top down, kind of? So here's Paris, with the Arc de Triomphe in the center, and then these radial avenues coming from it, kind of making sense out of the hodgepodge of chaotic streets. Then here's Washington, D.C., La Enfance plan for it, which is a grid overlaid with radial streets connecting it. So rationalizing cities by redeveloping them, by changing them. And this really reached its peak with the work of Le Corbusier in the 1930s to the 1960s or so, he designed the Radiant City, which thank God was never built. This is Chandigarh in India, which actually was built. It's an administrative center, top down, completely designed and built, and no one wanted to live there. The people would work, and then they would move from whatever apartment they were given. Many of them moved to the outskirts of town and put up their own little dwellings around the outside because it's so sterile. I mean, these are places that look great from 30,000 feet. They're beautiful and they're orderly, and you get down in them and they are sterile and dead. So this really reached its peak, this whole rationalization of cities and planning, central planning and all that, with this guy. This is Robert Moses, who ran all of the construction authorities in Manhattan and really New York State for about 30 years, all the bridges. So he built, or he he could, at the stroke of a pen, get anything built. He had so much power. He was one of the most powerful people in the country. If you're interested in that kind of power over, his biography is a book called The Power Broker, and it really shows how he did it. It's horrifying. But he built the Triborough Bridge, the Whitestone Bridge, the Verrazano Narrows Bridge, the Cross Bronx Expressway, FDR Drive, Shea Stadium, Lincoln Center. He remade New York City, and he essentially created suburbia almost single-handedly by building all these expressways going out into the suburbs, and people just blew out of the city like a pressure cooker to the suburbs. And here he is with one of his pet little projects, and you can see how clean and sterile it all is. And his way of working would be urban renewal. He would tear down whatever was there, displace all the people who lived there, just rip it out, and then they'd build something that looked like this. Yeah, and most of these have been torn down because they're unlivable, they're horrible places, and they're crime-ridden, and everyone's anonymous, and there's no way to actually meet or form community or anything like that. So most of them have been torn down. There's still a few of these projects left. So his next vision was to build the Lower Manhattan Expressway, which was going to be an expressway that was going to run straight through Greenwich Village and down into that part of Lower Manhattan. And when he put out the plans, he didn't realize that he was going to have to contend with this woman, who is one of my heroes, Jane Jacobs. She had just published an article in Forbes called Downtown is for People that was absolutely showing why it was just crazy to do these sorts of top-down planning, to plan for cars, to plan for business, but not to plan for people. And her argument was you can't plan. You can't do that kind of design. Design has to come from the bottom up when you're talking about people. And she was able to, along with a bunch of other people, get the Lower Manhattan Expressway knocked out. She essentially destroyed Robert Moses. He was kind of shuffled off the stage. Corruption was revealed in his office, surprise, surprise, things like that. But she wrote an incredible manifesto called The Death and Life of Great American Cities, which is, although it's 50 years old now, it's well worth reading still. It's a permaculture book. It's just amazing. She came up with the term social capital. That's hers. That is Jane Jacobs who came up with that. She also came up with the idea, the importance of mixed use, the importance of having businesses where people lived rather than segregating them, which will give you a dead suburb during the day and a dead city at night. Places that are half dead most of the time, in other words. These are vibrant places. She talked about mixed ages in buildings. You can't just bulldoze something and build everything new because only corporations can afford the new rents. If you want bodegas and bookstores and cafes and the places that people actually go and where their lives are based, you need mixed ages, so there's less expensive rents. You need eyes on the street. That's what the mixed use gives you. That makes a city safe. She has great anecdotes of, just some kind of funny-looking guy talking to a little girl, and all of a sudden there are like 8 people watching him, just paying attention to what's he up to? Is he okay? Those sorts of things. That's what you need to make cities that are human. She also talked about the importance of what I think of as a fractal city that's made of a lot of small parts that are loosely combined rather than a big monolith. And I'm going to talk a lot about Portland because it's a city that I knew really well, and I know best of all since I lived there for 6 years very recently. And what makes Portland, one of the things that makes Portland a really vibrant city is it is divided into 95 neighborhoods. They're formal neighborhoods. Each one has a neighborhood association that is entitled to face time in front of the city council whenever they want. So it's a voting neighborhood association. And those 95 neighborhoods are about 5,000 to 10,000 people apiece, so that they're villages, roughly. So it's not a monolithic city of 600,000, it's 95 villages, and people really identify with their village, with their neighborhood. I lived in the Brooklyn neighborhood, and my friend Mark Lakeman was down in Selwood, and my other friends are in Buckman, and that sort of thing. That's what you did say. You live in Portland, you say you live in Buckman. So this fractal approach then scales up, because in Portland, these 95 neighborhoods then coalesce into larger groups of neighborhood coalitions. Each one of those colored blocks is a dozen to 25 or so neighborhoods, and these have real political clout. They get time with the mayor and time with the city council. They can actually write legislation, propose legislation, so they have a lot of power. So what you've got is a city that has individuals who form families and households, that live on blocks, that form neighborhoods, that form neighborhood coalitions, that have upwards input into the city government rather than just simply stuff flowing down from the government. And that's a really important piece to make cities livable, is this upward movement of information, the grassroots again. I mean, it's no surprise to anybody in permaculture, but this is, you know, these are the rules, these are the guidelines, the things we know. You can't design a whole city. You can design a framework that allows interesting things to emerge by putting together these loose pieces. You know, we've got people who inspire one another. We create sacred space together. The city has administration that allows people to feel secure. Then we can gather safely and we create community. We exchange goods, we exchange ideas, and they all link together in this fantastic webwork of very loosely connected, dynamic, shifting relationships with each other. And that's the part that you can't design very far. One of the phrases that I like in permaculture is we talk about creating the conditions for X to occur. You just set the stage and then you let new interesting things emerge from it. And that's the kind of, I think of that as design without design. We know that these processes are bigger than we are and we have the hubris to admit that. So we just use permaculture's methods and principles to set the stage for these things to happen. And this is really important with cities because you can't manage people like that. You know, they're not predictable. So I want to go back to this list of salient features of cities because there was one on this list that I kept thinking should be there and I could not arrive at it, something that's very near and dear to me and I'm sure to most of you. And in permaculture, we don't impose solutions. We let the design tools help us arrive at them through the design tools. And the thing I couldn't arrive at easily was food production in cities. It didn't seem like an essential function. I mean, there are cities that grow a lot of food, but most food production in cities is very small scale. And so I was looking at this, okay, now why didn't I arrive at that as an important function? And I do think it's important for many, many reasons. I still think we should be doing food production in cities, but not because it's going to feed lots of people easily and cheaply. And that brings this up, that land's really expensive in cities. And food is really cheap comparatively, so it's hard to make a living. So, you know, unless your food is highly subsidized or you get paid, you know, by somebody else to grow food or something, it's really hard to grow inexpensive food in cities. The crops that actually feed us, the grains, the meat and dairy, the big stuff, requires a lot of land. The calorie crops require a lot of land. I was just talking to a quinoa farmer the other day who said, I'm growing 5 acres of quinoa and it's not enough. I can't make a living off of it. I need to be growing 10. So you can grow some calorie crops, but you need big land to do it. The stuff we do grow in cities for the most part are low calorie crops. They're high in phytonutrients. They're great things, but a pound of kale only has 150 calories. So if I'm trying to get my 2,000 calories every day out of kale, I need to eat 15 pounds of kale. I mean, I love kale, but I'm not going to eat 15 pounds. So this means that it's really hard to make the argument that you can feed low-income people with urban-grown food because it's expensive. And another reason that it's expensive is that you got to import everything instead of a closed loop. That's very hard to do on a small piece of urban land, except with some very specialized techniques. Usually the soil and the air in cities is pretty toxic, so it translates to not such healthy food. The city boundary is not an ecological unit. In other words, your soil types are not going to match up with where your property lines and other things are, and microclimates and all of that. So it's hard to just say, I'm going to go find some good land in the city to grow food on. It's hard to know. And then one that intrigued me a lot was that we all have heard the story of the 1,500-mile salad. You know, the average salad in the U.S. travels 1,500 miles from the farm to the table. It turns out, and so that creates this very charismatic idea, this very grabby idea of the food miles concept. It turns out that that's not actually a really good leverage point to be working. It's a sexy idea and we grab a hold of it. But if you actually look at the energy footprint of food production, where the energy of producing food comes from or where it's used, it looks like I'm missing a slide. Okay, well the numbers are, 84% of the energy in growing food is on farm, 4% of it is used to transport it from the farm to the distributor, to the store, to the house. 4%. So you can cut your food miles in half and you're only eliminating 2% of the energy footprint of food. The farm is the place where you've got to work. which is a great argument for small farms, local farms, all sorts of things like that. There are many reasons to grow food in cities. You know, create that farm-to-table connection, get people's hands in the dirt, connect people to the earth. I mean, all of these reasons. But those are not essential functions, in other words. So this bothered me. I hate running into ideas like that. My favorite pet things, you know, like earthworms are an invasive species. I hate that idea, but it's true. So here's an old city. This is Damascus. You can see there's not much room in there to grow food. Most cities didn't have enough room in them for food until the automobile era and the freeways and the sprawl that happened. It was mostly rich people who could afford gardens in cities. This is the pattern of food production for cities. You get a core, a village core, an urban core, and it's surrounded by farmland. And people leave the village, some of them to work in the farms every day, and then they bring the food back in. That's been the pattern for 6,000 to 8,000 years, ever since the evolution of cities, really. This is how cities have been fed. And this explains the really baffling license plate of New Jersey, which is the Garden State. I mean, I've been in northern New Jersey, and it ain't no garden. No offense to New Jerseyites. The state plant is the pharmaceutical plant in New Jersey. But New York City, what explains that license plate is New York City used to be fed by the truck gardens of New Jersey and rural New York and Connecticut up until the 1960s. Most of New York's food came from a fairly small radius around New York City. With the advent of frozen food, refrigerated transportation, really cheap oil so we could move food long distances cheaply, and suburban sprawl that paved over a lot of the farmland, that pattern has changed. But it's the old one, and it's one that has made sense for as long as cities have been around. So we may see it again. This also brings up another idea of Jane Jacobs, which is the importance of the city region, the city's connection to the rural area around it. Jacobs showed research that says that the health of a rural area is nowhere near as dependent on things like good soil or climate or adequate rainfall as it is on the vigor of the urban area that it surrounds or is near. That's why when Detroit went down, it took a lot of Michigan with it. When Pittsburgh went down, it took a lot of Western Pennsylvania with it, because that connection is really important. It's the cities that really provide livelihood, education, all sorts of things. This really great exchange in a healthy city region is really important. And also, if I could engage in some stereotyping for a moment, cities tend to have more progressive people in them. They tend to be more liberal or more progressive than rural areas. So it's very often the urban folk who are in support of organic food and local food and support your local farms and let's not pave over in the farmland. And it's very often the urbanites who are driving that move to a more sustainable and more regional food system. But also, I think there's another really important reason that we need to have this good city-region connection, and that's because if we don't get out of the city periodically, I think we go insane. I mean, that's the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, and those people are out of their minds as far as I'm concerned. That looks nuts. Work there, you got to get out periodically. What happens to us in cities if we spend too much time or in just purely human environments that have no feedback from nature is we build these giant intellectual edifices of ideas upon ideas upon ideas, and there's no feedback with reality. This is why economists who mostly live in cities have been able to come up with the idea of the infinite growth economy. Get out into nature a bit and you will see that nothing grows forever except cancer. That sort of thing. So that's why I think it's really important to have that city-region connection for yet another reason, to keep us sane, to give us feedback from something real, to make sure we're not just going off on some wild idea that actually has really bad consequences. So I want to move into a little bit of a permaculture toolkit now, just how permaculture can help us do this design without design. And I want to start with the idea of the food shed, which I think most of you are familiar with. If we are going to talk about more local food, having vibrant urban city regions, then we want to be able to design healthy food sheds. Right now, the food shed, the area that our food comes from for the average American, is the whole planet, right? Strawberries come from Chile in the wintertime, apples come from Australia. all these sorts of things in New Zealand. So if we want to shrink our food shed and have it be more localized, the permaculture zone system, which I imagine pretty much everyone here is familiar with, really helps us with this. So zone 1, if you're living in a city, would be your garden. You try to meet whatever portion of your food needs makes sense from your own garden. And a lot of us, a lot of urban people don't have gardens. That's okay. It still works. But yeah, so you'd make decisions like, what does it make sense for me to grow in my garden? And these would be things like really expensive foods, or foods that you eat a lot of, or foods that you really like, or foods that are really easy to grow in your conditions. You're probably not going to meet all your food needs in zone 1. So then we move on to community-supported agriculture and community gardens, where some of it you're doing yourself, and you can certainly see the people who are growing it and talk to them, and probably be at the farms, be at the plots of land. So you got lots of control, lots of input, lots of back and forth relationship with the people who are growing food. You're still probably not going to meet all your food needs just in those 2, so you expand to the farmers markets, the ones that are primarily local, but they'll import a few things that you can't actually grow around there. You're probably still going to have a few things that you can't, that aren't going to meet your food needs, some staples like coffee and chocolate and things like that. So that's when you go to, the independent groceries that support local farms but do import things. And then, so that's probably going to meet most of your food needs right there, if not all of them. If you still got a few things that, you really want, that's when you sneak into Costco and hope none of your green friends see you there, that sort of thing. I think of zone 5 here as, the area least frequently visited that you have very little effect on. That's how we treat zone 5, is we don't manage it, we don't have effect on it. So someone pointed out at one of Starhawk's classes, and no surprise it was there, they said, zones 1, 2, and 3, that's great, but underprivileged people in cities don't get those. They don't have those. Those are missing. And I really, so the comment was sort of like, this is kind of an elitist attitude towards food a little bit. Yes, and what it points out, and one of the things I love about permaculture's design tools, is there's the leverage point. We need zones 1, 2, and 3s to be created in those food deserts. That's what we need to be doing to help bring those back, to help eliminate those food deserts. So it identifies the leverage point, and that's why I love porting permaculture's design tools into human systems, because although they were developed for landscape, they work really well for human systems. So a couple of other examples of how we can use the zone system in non-human contexts, in non-landscape contexts, would be in relationships. Like, who's in your zone 1? You're the people you see the most, spouse or partner in your zone 1. Then zone 2 would be people living in your home. Zone 3 would be your close friends and colleagues that you really spend a lot of time with, and casual acquaintances in zone 4. Zone 5 would be people who you see occasionally, that really cool checkout person down at the store whose name you don't know, but you always like to get in their line because you know you're going to have an enjoyable time. And this helps me think about things like, boy, that person's gotten into my zone 2, and they really belong out in my zone 4. So just helping to understand the impact of the relationships in your life. So there's another use of the zone system. There are tons of them.
Become a child at your house.
Well, yes, I become very childlike when I get indoors. Children living at home. Some children don't live at home is what that means. So a nonprofit, potential roles in a nonprofit, zone 1 might be the board of directors. Zone 2 would be staff. Zone 3 would be the donors. Zone 4 would be the volunteers, each with a little less power, a little less influence, and then going out to the community served. Although some people in nonprofits would say, no, this is exactly backwards. It's the community served that should be at the center. And maybe, hopefully we hardly ever see the board of directors or that sort of thing. Then one of my favorite examples, this wonderful middle school teacher named Michael Becker, who took a permaculture course up at the Bullock Brothers farm years ago, was so inspired that he created this completely permaculture-based curriculum for his middle school students. And I could go on for hours about what Michael has done with these students. It's unbelievable. But that's a different talk. And so Michael has studied learning a lot because he's interested in how people learn. And one of the things that research has shown is that it's really hard to learn when you're not comfortable. If you're nervous, if you're anxious, if you're scared, it's very hard to learn. So he talks about comfort zones in terms of learning. So zone 1 activities would be things that are very familiar to you, just stuff that you slam dunk to do, really, really easy. Then zone 2 would be non-stressful things, but they're a little bit new to you, but they're not stressful. And then zone 3 would be things that you want to do, but they are going to be a challenge, like learning to play a new musical instrument or something. It's going to be rough at first. You're going to sound terrible, but you'll get it and you want to do it. Then zone 4 would be things that you don't want to do, but you're being compelled by some force to do them, like your job a lot of the time. And then zone 5 would be things where you would just rather die than do that. No way, I'm not going to do it. And Michael tells this great story that I'm going to borrow from him. Well, actually, I'm stealing, I guess, because he doesn't get it back. But yeah, he could use it again. It's true. It's like pirated software. So Michael was very nomadic when he was young, and he traveled all around the world, and his parents were pretty much okay with that, except for one thing. His mother was really bothered by the fact that he was doing his laundry in public laundromats. Just, the idea that his clothes were going into a washing machine that somebody else's dirty underwear were in like minutes before. Just, it was zone 5 for her. It was a horrible thing to contemplate for her. So when Michael met the woman that he later married, they fell in love, they decided they would live together, and he understood that the living together piece was also going to be challenging for his mother. So when he made the announcement, he said, "Mom, Meg and I are going to live together, and the house has got a washer and dryer." And Mom was so taken by the whole washing machine thing that the living together thing just kind of sailed right past. So we can tailor our learning experiences, kind of helping people toward the learning experience that we would like them to have. That's a little manipulative there, but you can understand the principle holds. We connect a new thing to a familiar thing, and people can learn a lot better that way. All right, and there are lots of other ways to use zones in human context, but I'll move on to sectors, which are influences coming from off the site. Things like, the classic permaculture outdoor sectors like wind and sun and wildlife and fire and flooding and things like that. This is obviously an Australian map because sunward is to the north. Got to throw in the little Aussie thing a bit. But if you think about human sectors then, moving on from the natural ones, so here's a design by Larry Santoyo, who's a really great designer down in LA. This is in Morro Bay on the coast. And the big sector there, well, there are a couple of them. This is the design after it's done. This is west, and a very cold wind blows lots of the time from the ocean there. The other big sector here is that you see this house. It's kind of gray behind here, a little hard to see, but that's the neighbor's house. The two women who lived in this house, liked to garden in a bathing suit or sometimes less when they could, and that was just fine with the guy who lived in this house, who would actually go up to the second floor and sit there while they were out gardening. Really kind of, creepy. So when Larry designed this tea house for them to hang out in, a beautiful structure, yes, he put it in the wind corridor, but he also put it in the peeping Tom sector as well. So really nice stacking of functions here, and really good sector analysis. So we've got the natural sectors, we've got the view sector, we have the all-important neighbor sector in urban areas like this. Then we've got other human-oriented sectors, the noises that are made, pollution, homeowners associations and zoning, really big ones. They dictate what we can and cannot build a lot of the time. Sectors are really, really, really important. And I could tell you many horror stories, as I'm sure anybody who does design work here, of people who did poor sector analysis and missed important sectors, and it just wrecked the whole design. You just suddenly find you're in an unlivable space because you forgot that it was going to be 106 degrees and you didn't have any shade or something like that. So I like the phrase sectors trump everything. You really want to get your sector analysis right, and the human sectors are really important. If you do really clever design, if you understand your sectors really well, sometimes those unpleasant sectors can be made to just disappear altogether. You can just get them to go away. An example of this is a design by Mark Lakeman of City Repair up in Portland, where he put together a cob bench. It was in a public space. He wanted to build a roof over it because it's Portland and it rains. And as soon as he came up with a design for the roof, the city said, well, you need a permit for a roof that size, and a permit's going to be several $1,000s. So Mark said, well, what's the biggest roof I can build without a permit? And that is the size right there. So he just strung them all together. And this also brings up the permaculture principle of the problem is the solution, because that's a more elegant design than having one roof. It's a nice innovative thing. So if you understand your sectors well enough, you can actually make the negative ones just kind of disappear and use them to enhance your design and come up with ideas that you maybe wouldn't have come up with. Then urban sectors, there was a guy in a permaculture course, that one of the very first ones that I co-taught years ago, a guy named Bart Anderson, lives in Palo Alto. He's one of the editors of a resilience.org website, great guy. But he lives in an apartment, and he said, look, I love zones and sectors and things, but I live in an apartment, I don't even have a yard. But he came up with this sector and zone map, where zones are based on the type of transportation you use to get somewhere, walking, cycling, transit, that sort of thing. And then sectors are things like the corporate influence, local businesses, community, churches and clubs, friends and family, those sorts of things. And then he populated this with the various things in his life, trying to move as many of the things that he used most often into the inner zones, walking and cycling, and trying to minimize the influences that he didn't want. Like, he realized that the corporate influence right inside his house was television, so let's get rid of television, those sorts of things. So a nice way to combine zones and sectors in human areas. Then the third method that I'll talk about briefly is matching needs to resources, or needs and yields analysis, we often call it, where make a list of your needs, make a list of your resources, how many of your resources can meet your needs, where can you acquire the other resources to help meet your needs, what do you have in surplus. The idea is to make all these beneficial connections so that you don't have to be buying a lot of stuff. Needs can be met within your design. So a way to look at this in an urban context is to ask, what do we have a lot of in cities? What's really abundant? An abundant resource, people, lots of buildings, lots of built material and salvage, couches out at the curb, that sort of thing. There's more money in urban areas than in rural, lots of jobs in commerce, relatively speaking. And we've seen that there's more innovation. And then we do the same for things that are scarce in cities. We've got land is pretty scarce and expensive. Organic matter is kind of hard to come by, same with raw materials. And then we're busy in cities, so time is hard to come by. And then you've got matching them. So buildings are abundant, land is scarce. So you put that together, you use buildings in place of land, and you come up with something like this. This is not Photoshop. That is a design by a Austrian architect named Hundertwasser, who not only has trees on top, which is okay, people are doing all sorts of rooftop gardens, but he's got special windows the trees are growing out of. So this is a nice example of what one of my mentors, Tom Ward, calls ultimate permaculture. He says we have 3 levels of design in permaculture. There's the quick fix, which is like your gutter's leaking, so you stick a bucket under it to catch the water. Then there's the retrofit, and we're doing a lot of retrofitting these days because we live in a fairly built environment. It's rare that you get to tear everything down or start with a blank slate and build a big apartment complex. Usually we're dealing with a built space that we have to retrofit. So that would be, you fix the gutter and you redirect the downspout to a place where the water is going to do some good. But you have in your mind the idea of ultimate permaculture, which is to redesign the whole system and tie all the downspouts together and fill cisterns and irrigate your garden and all of that. That's the ultimate permaculture. And that's, I find, a really useful tool because it means it's okay to do quick solutions because we've got the ultimate thing in mind somewhere that we will try and get to one of these days. So in looking at that, got the same illustration again, excuse me. Move on, yeah, I got double. Okay, so lots of buildings. There's vertical gardening, lettuces just on an old wall. Again, this is retrofitting here. This is new construction. That's an artist concept of a building in Milan that is now complete, 22 stories tall with full-grown trees on it. And this prompted people to think, what happens if a branch off of a big tree falls 18 stories down to the ground? And someone wrote an article saying, can we stop drawing trees on top of buildings? Again, we want to arrive at this as a solution. And that's kind of imposing. I mean, it's cool, but So rooftop gardens are all the rage these days. Lots of living roofs and gardens on top of roofs. Obviously, use that space. My feeling is let's use the land in cities first and then move up to the roofs because it's much more expensive. And challenging to garden on rooftops, but they're great things to do with many benefits. Then container gardening, here's someone who's just gardening in garbage cans, or someone who's taken a 12-inch corrugated culvert and slit it and wrapped it around their spiral staircase and just pour water in at the top and it irrigates it. If you don't even have that much space, we got mobile gardens. Here's someone gardening in shopping carts. There's a little roll-around garden bed. Here's a pickup truck with a greenhouse on it.
Yeah.
You know? So get creative. Again, vertical, stretchy bags full of soil and 2-liter soda bottles and canvas bags and lots and lots of places. Or aquaponics that Max Myers and other folks are going to talk about a lot. Really useful for very small spaces, concentrated. Lots of high food production, meets protein needs as well. Also, just do an assessment. Where is the land in cities? Who's got it? Community gardens are one source, but also school gardens. If you're a parent or a teacher or a volunteer or a kid, you can participate in school garden programs and get some of the produce. Also, churches, apartment buildings, offices. Google actually now has I can't remember the job title, it's manager of horticultural services or something like that, in charge of their employee-supported agriculture. Pepsi has a similar position. A lot of businesses are doing employee-supported agriculture. Churches, their mission is to support their community. So they often have land, and it's become community gardens a lot more. A couple of permaculture principles with some really cool applications in urban settings. This is the work of Mark Lakeman in City Repair, and some of the tremendous work he's done. I'm going to really compress this story. It can be a longer and really beautiful story, but in the interest of keeping this brief. So Mark and his neighbors, lived on an intersection. This isn't it, but it kind of felt like this sterile place that was designed for cars. And they had this idea of, well, first they wanted to slow down traffic. They wanted a traffic circle, but the city told them to get a traffic circle, you'd either pay $10,000 and they would build it, or if there was a fatality at the intersection, they would build it for you. So they kind of looked for volunteers. But so as they were thinking about this, they thought, all right, we're just going to paint a traffic circle. We're just going to do it ourselves. And as they started thinking about painting the traffic circle, they came up with this idea, the 4 neighbors, of maybe they could put stuff on each corner, build an information kiosk and build a free box and library bin and build a children's play station and a little coffee station as well. So they built a model, they made plans and built a model and took this model into the city, the DOT, the Department of Transportation, and said, we want to do this. And the city just, no one's ever done that before, so we can't do it. Or there's no permit for it, so you can't do it. It's public property, so you can't use it. That sort of story. But fortunately, there was someone in the DOT at a different desk who overheard this conversation, and he said, he actually followed them out to the elevator, rode down the elevator with them and said, I love this idea, and I can't give you a permit for that, but I write the city's block party permits. So if you closed off both streets for the weekend and held a block party, and if something happened, and so that was the idea, better to ask forgiveness than permission. So that's what they did. So they closed off the streets, they had a huge party, all the neighbors came, a lot of the other folks came, painted the traffic circle. This was really smart. They were going to build a bunch of structures out in public, really cool little structures, and they knew they're pattern literate, that it's a city, they're going to get vandalized. Someone's going to trash them, of course. So they recruited the future vandals, the 9 to 14-year-old boys in the neighborhood, to help them build. They got them involved in the project, and these kids became the champions of this project. They're now big, they've grown, so they're capable of defending this. You don't mess with this stuff. So here's the library shelves and the produce station. Here's the tea and coffee station, and it's still there 12 years later. That's when this was built, about 12 years ago. And I was there a couple weeks ago, and there was a thermos of hot water chained to the post with a bunch of old mugs sitting there, and you could make coffee for yourself or tea every morning. And then here's the children's play station, and there it is from one of the rooftops. And this is not street paint. They couldn't use street paint, so it wears out every year, so they just have another big party and repaint it and redesign it and have a really great time there. And this is a small thing, just painting the traffic circle was how it got started. But so when they built this, someone from the DOT drove through it a couple days later and looked at it and just freaked out and said, we're going to sandblast this and we're going to charge you for it. And we're going to tear everything down and charge it for taking it to the dump. Fortunately, some of the neighbors had lived there long enough that they knew how to get a hold of the mayor, and they brought the mayor in, and she was this really progressive woman named Vera Katz, who looked at it and said, well, let me get this straight. You're slowing down traffic, you're creating community, you got a presence on the street, you're probably reducing crime because there are people on the street, probably increasing property values because it's really cool, probably reducing insurance costs because there's less crime on the street. She said, these are all amenities, all values that Portland subscribes to. You can do this anywhere you want. So there is now an intersection repair ordinance in Portland and getting to be in a number of other cities. Here are some of the other ones that were built. This was where the neighbor here, the owner, the absentee landlord of this business, wouldn't allow them to do it, so they did it in chalk instead. And there are now at least 35 in Portland, and LA's got some, Sebastopol had one done, Eugene's got some, Seattle's got some, Denver's got some. They're all over the place now. So Oakland's got them, that's right. You know, it was funny, as I was doing the research for the Permaculture City, there was a group of cities, every time I would Google permaculture, you know, urban chickens, or permaculture, whatever, you know, community building, or social justice or something, Portland and Oakland were at the top of the list. And then Detroit and Pittsburgh were the other two cities because well, Oakland does too, but Portland and, Detroit and Pittsburgh are, you know, are dying cities. So they need those innovations now. But yeah, it was just interesting to see over and over. And the last one on the list, the other most common one was Jamaica Plain outside of Boston, doing a bunch of really interesting things. But it's just interesting to see the same cities coming up over and over and over again. Okay, those are cool places. All right, and another permaculture principle, and someone here is going to talk about this, I understand, over the weekend, which is really cool, is start small and grow by chunking, or don't bite it all off at once. Do something small. If you don't know how to do it, try something small, you know, design a new guild or whatever it is, and get successful on a small scale, and then replicate it with variations around it and learn a little more each time, and gradually it'll get big, and you grow by chunks, by chunking. You put chunks together and you make something big. And this was, so Oakland, like many other cities, has food deserts in it, places where there's no food or nothing but fast food within a quarter mile. And these folks in Oakland thought, well, we want to help cure our food desert. So they actually spoke to some of the grocery stores, tried to ask them to come in, and the stores, you know, the chains all said, nah, you know, we're not interested in that market. And so they wound up, well, first their idea was to build a grocery store, you know, and then they realized, well, we've never run a store, and we don't have any money, we don't have any capital, so how are we going to do this? So instead they got a used delivery truck and painted it and created the mobile market, where they picked up a bunch of produce and they will drive around to community centers and senior centers and other places where people gather and sell produce off the truck. And this was so popular that a whole bunch of places in the neighborhood where there were vacant lots are growing produce. There are 14 at least different gardens now that grow produce for the mobile market. They've expanded, they've continued, they've been going on for a number of years now, and now they have the money to actually do a storefront, the People's Grocery, which is underway. So that's growing by chunking, you know, when you're limited by financial capital and things like that, and experience. And speaking of which, so how do we get around the money thing? You know, how do we make money a less important part of our lives? These two guys on the East Coast, Ethan Rowland and Gregory Landua, inspired by some of John Young's work with the 8 Shields program, have come up with 8 forms of capital. We all know about financial capital, and because of Jane Jacobs, we know about social capital, but there's also material capital, the built environment or the tools you own and that sort of thing, your physical, the built stuff you have. There's living capital, plants, animals, soil, the life that supports us. You build that capital up and it supports you. Cultural capital, the wisdom and accumulation over the generations of your own culture and how that supports you and what it yields to you and what you give to it. Experiential capital, the lessons you've learned in life, the things that you know that have given you wisdom and skills in life. Intellectual capital, the brain stuff that you know and the support that gives you. And then spiritual capital, the grounding and support that gives you, and social capital. And all of these together really support you. and greatly reduce your need for financial capital, and they're more stable, all of them, than financial capital. You know, who knows what Wall Street is up to? But I know what my friends are up to, and I know what the plants and animals are up to, and I know what my culture is up to, you know. So these are much more stable sources of support, and together they form this really great reinforcing web work that greatly reduces your reliance on money. You can reduce the need to earn this way. Their website is 8forms.org, the numeral 8 forms, and they have a book, and they've got a bunch of cool things on their website showing you how to apply these ideas. It's really terrific stuff. So a nice example of using these other forms of capital is a place that I've done some teaching and work. A guy named Adam Brock is the director of the growhous, but it was a wealthy developer in Denver who'd made a lot of money making fancy restaurants, decided it was time to give something back to the community. He bought this set of 5 abandoned greenhouses that's in an industrial, kind of a former industrial wasteland, very underprivileged area, toxic soil, and he converted them to food production or established this nonprofit that then did this. So they're growing, they have a huge aquaponics operation along with some other types of growing operations, producing a huge amount of food. A lot of the food goes into this farmer's market that's in the front of the buildings. They also do provide some for sale to other farmers markets and restaurants, but a whole bunch of it goes to their storefront, which is a pay what you can store for the neighbors. For this underprivileged, ethnically very diverse, many different languages spoken in this neighborhood, people of many different colors living there. And it's not only a place to get food, though. It's become a job training center, an education center. A lot of the neighbors work in this place. It's where you can find out about programs that you qualify for. It's become the neighborhood hub, and it's developing a whole set of these other forms of capital for the neighborhood. And it's really enlivening this once really blighted neighborhood. So it's a very nice example. Other cool projects, and many of us know Pathways to Resilience and Planning Justice. I know Pandora's going to be up here, and great folks, Gavin Raiders, and lots of other wonderful people working with formerly incarcerated people out of San Quentin, and other really serious prisons, providing them with a permaculture design course and specialized education to get them back out in the world. The recidivism rate here is vastly lower for these people once they've gone through this program than it is for typical ex-cons. So it's tremendously successful, inspiring programs, and I'm really honored to know some of these folks. In my town of Sebastopol, Eric Olson got together with the city and helped design, and Eric will be up here, the set of 4 different gardens, a native and native use garden, a pioneer and immigrant era garden, a Luther Burbank garden, because that's where he's from, and a more permacultural food forest garden that's at City Hall and the library, out in public, funded by the city, built mostly by volunteers. A really terrific project that's about 2 to 3 years old now and is really coming along. Another great public project that's gotten a lot of press is the Beacon Hill Food Forest in Seattle. Billed as the largest public food forest in the nation. It may or may not be, but it's a really great project. Came out of a permaculture design course, was one of the design projects, and the people were so fired up by it that they decided, let's make it real, let's really do it. So they got permission from the city eventually to take 2 acres at a park on Beacon Hill, which is again a very diverse neighborhood. And they did huge amounts of community outreach. There was a Samoan soccer team that played there every Saturday, so they talked to them. What would make this desirable to you? What kind of plants do you want? They went to the various Asian communities nearby, all the different communities nearby, and talked with them and said, how can we make this feel like your park? What can we do? When they started having public meetings, the biggest objection that everyone raised was, what happens if someone steals all the fruit? And Jenny said, that'd be great, because it shows we need more of them. But also that's not the problem. The problem is the fruit rots on the ground. People don't know about harvesting fruit. Someone else said, what if some homeless people set up a camp and harvest all the fruit and start selling it? And it's like, well, that'd be sort of cool, wouldn't it, actually? But they're actually very responsive and very sensitive to comments and neighbors' feelings, and really got a lot of buy-in on it. Did that people piece in a really skillful way. If you don't want to tackle dealing with the city in a big public project, Here's Mark Lakeman's office in Portland, which is a public food forest. He just got all this amazing food all over his office on 12th Avenue, which is a really busy street, so tons and tons of traffic. And then a little more locally, two projects that came out of a couple of my permaculture courses in Petaluma that I'm just delighted to see. See, in a lot of PDCs, a lot of permaculture courses, the design projects never get built, or they're pretty small scale and not for the public. They're like somebody's backyard or these sorts of things. And a group of teachers kind of got together and said, let's make it so these projects are going to be more real and that they get done and that they serve the community. So I insist in my courses that there be a community component. You need to have the regular old food and land and water and energy and all those components, but there needs to be a community component and there needs to be a livelihood component. It has to either pay for itself or support the people who are there, somehow fund itself, not just be dependent on grants or rich people or whatever. And so one of the projects that came out of one of my courses is the Francisco Reservoir in the city, in San Francisco, which is an abandoned reservoir that's been sitting there since like the 50s or something, abandoned for a really long time because no one can agree on what to do with it. And the water department owns it, and it's worth like $50 million, so they don't, they want to sell it. But it's just all this politics has left it just abandoned and ugly, and obviously a very prime site in San Francisco. And so this design group came up with an idea for it. They, again, did community outreach, talked to people in the neighborhood, got a bunch of ideas from the neighborhood, worked together, created this plan, presented it to the neighbors. One of the neighbors knew the city commissioner. Or the city supervisor in San Francisco. So they got a meeting with the city supervisor who loved it, who took them into the mayor's office. They got a meeting with the mayor of San Francisco who also liked it. They started pulling strings. They started talking to people. The water bureau, water department said, well, okay, we'll sell it for $20 million instead of $50 million. Eventually they came down and deeded it for $1 to the Parks Department. So this is now underway. It's going to be modified because it's, city politics and all that. But some of the essential features are going to be preserved. So this came out of a permaculture design course. It's really cool. And then another one, I don't know why this graphic isn't showing up, but you've all seen Petaluma, many of you. Petaluma when it floods, when it rains. So I had a picture of, flooding in Petaluma. My PDC in Petaluma a couple of years ago, the vice mayor of Petaluma took it, Tiffany Renee, and she knew that the city had to come up with a new stormwater management plan because of these flood problems, and the city was starting to come up with just your basic, well, let's build bigger pipes. Let's drain it into the bay even faster. So this design group came up with a proposal with all of permaculture's great water management ideas. And this is my little nod towards drought right now. This talk doesn't talk about drought. I actually have a separate 90-minute presentation on rethinking drought, but I'll mention the word drought, bing, because it's important right now. But this plan, the new plan that the design group came up with, has infiltration basins and rain gardens and curb cuts and swales and the whole gamut of permaculture methods for dealing with water and for getting it into the soil instead of treating it as waste, and mycoremediation and all sorts of things like that. And the city is beginning to implement portions of it. It has become a part of their new stormwater management plan. So another one coming out of a PDC. It's really fun. It just makes me so happy to see this real world stuff that's going to affect lots of people. Many of us in permaculture, the idea, something that's really deep in our hearts, is to re-indigenate, is to become part of the land, to really understand a piece of land, to understand our area and our culture. And we do that by kind of going around the permaculture flower and meeting needs for food, for water, for shelter, for energy, for community, for waste, for health, for all of the basic human needs. And it turns out that the same skill set that you need to do that on a piece of land are exactly the skill set that disaster relief, that first responders need. So permaculturists are acting as first responders all over the world now. It really first started to happen, as far as I know, at Hurricane Katrina, but in Haiti, in Nepal, in Japan, in many, many other places that have been hit with disasters, permaculturists are among the first to show up. And I had a participant in one of my classes a few years ago who understood this, and he had worked for USAID in Kazakhstan, designing and building refugee camps back after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And refugee camps are hellholes. They're horrible places mostly. And he said if he had taken a PDC before he designed these camps, they would have been totally different. And he's gotten back into it. He asked me, how long does the average refugee, do I think, live in a refugee camp? It's 7 years. They don't just pop in and out. It's 7 years. Many of them spend their whole lives there. So they need to be better places to live. Okay, the last little bit then, the famous Hubbard's curve, peak oil and all that stuff, since we're talking transition. So I think all of you are familiar with this, but it's just the idea that the area under the curve is all the petroleum liquids on the planet, and we've used roughly half, and we're pretty much at peak production. Conventional oil production in the world has been flat since 2005. The really, really expensive and dangerous and environmentally disastrous non-conventional oils are the only things that have been going up. And most of that's been done by just printing money like mad to pay for it. And someday those bills will come due. It's not economically viable. But so we're going to be looking at coming down the far side, and that's going to be very interesting. It's part of why I want to live to be a really, really, really old man, is because I want to see how this plays out. It's going to be really interesting. There'll be some good places. There'll be some terrible places. I want to be in one of the good places, and I want to help create more of the good places. You know, it's a patchy universe, right? It's a patchy planet. There will be good places, so let's make more of those. So this ties into some ideas of various people looking at the nation state, which is the principal form of governance for the last couple centuries. It's really a new kid on the block. For thousands and thousands of years, there were two principal forms of government. There was either the empire, or two forms of state. There was the empire, and there was the city-state. The nation-state, although there are a few old ones like France and a few others, but many of them were city-states up until very recently. I mean, Germany was formed in the 19th century by Bismarck. Italy, also in the 19th century. The former colonies in Africa are these cobbled together states, for the most part, those nation states. Same with a lot of South America, the very recent nation states. And my thinking, along with some other people, is that the nation state really depends on an industrial civilization that's able to move people long distances really cheaply, mass communication. And there's a political scientist at Yale named James Scott who has studied the state. He studied anarchic societies, which is interesting coming from a tenured professor at Yale. But he points out that up until very recently, up until really World War II, states could not actually govern out of the valleys. They could only reach flatland. It was too expensive to get up into the hills. So hills all over the world have been where the wild people live, where the ungoverned areas have been until quite recently. A really interesting fact, so a part of that limit was until fossil fuels, it was very difficult to tax very far because urban areas generally paid their taxes in money, but rural areas up until pretty recently paid their taxes in grain. And it turns out that 100 miles is about as far as an ox cart full of grain can run before the ox eats all the grain in the cart. So that's the effective power radius of most states, is one ox cart's ride, essentially. So that was really the effective range of states until fossil fuels and rapid transportation and building freeways everywhere and all of that. So the state, I mean, you know, the interstate highway system is actually called the National Defense Interstate System, because it was really built by Eisenhower, who had a terrible experience in World War II trying to run Allied forces for Europe. Transportation was this big issue. Those little windy roads in France and Germany were just horrible to work with. So he wanted to be able to move stuff fast in big ways. So building the interstate was his idea, a way of solving the idea of moving convoys really quickly over large areas. So blitzkrieg could be popular, easily done in the interstate system. I digress. And what I mean to say is that, so the effective range of the state has generally been very small. An interesting factoid to permaculturists is that valley people tend to use grain, and that is easily measured and easily taxed, because you can tell, an acre of grain, an acre of wheat is going to yield this much, we're going to tax you that much. Hill people tend to grow tubers as their staple crop. Very hard to tell what a tuber yield is going to be. Very hard to tell what those tubers are, because they're in a polyculture, and tubers are not really economical to transport long distances. So that is another element of freedom for these stateless people is growing polycultures and not having a grain-based culture. So my thinking is that as energy descent continues, we will see a return to something more like the city-state pattern as nation-states become untenable. So here's this central core of some kind of city, big or small, and fed and surrounded by and nourished by and nourishing the rural area around it. But after all this talk about cities, I just want to share, my vision, and I think a lot of your vision also, just to wrap up, is just to toss out this whole idea. If I were doing ultimate permaculture on the planet and actually designing the conditions for really happy environment, happy people, healthy ecology, I would do something more like a horticultural village society, not based on agriculture at all, but based on horticulture, which is really what is at the heart of permaculture. It's a horticultural based system rather than agriculture. It's plant culture rather than field culture. Lots and lots of villages, lots and lots of land that people inhabit, but they inhabit because it helps support them. So that's kind of my vision. All right, that's going to wrap it up. And I am teaching a couple of permaculture design courses. I mentioned the one in Petaluma, which is going to run one weekend a month, November through April, and one outside of Sacramento at Soilborn Farm. I'm running October through March, and my website's tobyhemenway.com. All that information is there. Daily Acts, Trathan, and various other daily actors are going to be here this weekend. They'll have information on it. And I'm also doing an online course as well. More information at my website. And I will be back, it looks like, probably at the Living Mandala booth for a little bit after this talk. And happy to hang out and chat. And if you want to buy a copy of the Permaculture City, got them back there. Got a couple boxes of them. I've got a little bit of guys starting.